Well, first, thanks again. This workshop on lower and middle income countries, I enjoy participating in every year. I think it's like the only place to get to see what's new in the world of population studies and lower and middle income contexts with respect to aging. So very happy to be here. I thought this session was really great in terms of getting to see some kind of, new directions and new projects. Most of my comments are really keeping that in mind, that you're all sort of still in a, running models, kind of trying to interpret what you have stage. And my comments are also geared towards helping you think about how to, shape some things and some next steps you might take as you're thinking about preparing manuscripts to submit for publication. So I'm just going to go in the order of the session. So the first paper was examining urban-rural differences and disability in three-country contexts. I think that this urban-rural dimension has always been something very interesting in terms of trying to understand population health, dynamics, and disparities in a world that's constantly changing and with a rapidly aging population in a lot of these countries. This urban-rural dimension is maybe even more important than it has been in the past. And it really implicates a lot of things from, the changing family form due to migration patterns across urban rural areas to how we distribute services, particularly in very large countries like China, India, and Mexico. So I just have a couple of kind of questions that sort of popped into my mind as I was looking at the project and thinking of things that you could do to get a little, kind of squeeze a little more information inside out of the work. I think it actually be really helpful to know more about the urban and rural populations in the studies. So if you just do kind of an urban-rural variable or a stratified model, we go all the way very quickly to these correlations or associations. But I think it'd be really helpful to understand more about the population itself. So when we think about whether or not we think health is going to be better or worse in urban areas, I think we should be thinking about things like selective mortality. Is life expectancy really different in rural areas versus urban areas? Sometimes it's higher. Sometimes people are healthier in rural areas. So just thinking about some of the selection into some of these samples in these different countries, you're picking them all up in the same wave, but you're picking them up at different points in the progression of the longitudinal study. So that selectivity might vary across the three country studies as well. I was also wondering about educational distributions, not just across the countries, but the urban-rural differences in educational attainment in the countries. So sometimes that migration from rural areas to urban areas for economic opportunities comes with increased education, but I imagine that these education distributions probably are pretty different across China, Mexico, and India. So just having a better understanding of what those distributions look like, I think would help in kind of interpreting some of the findings later. Then the other thing I was thinking about was these institutional supports. So if you're thinking about something like pension, for instance, I'm pretty sure these surveys ask people these kinds of questions. I don't know off the top of my head what the like pension coverage is in urban and rural areas across these three countries. But even if you knew that if you had a variable that said the person does or doesn't have a pension, or if you have a country level characteristic that tells you what the pension coverage rate is, I'm also curious, how much is there diversification in the kinds of pensions people would get? So like what they would be qualified for in terms of even receiving a pension, or if there were differences in the amounts. And if there's any other kind of differences in pension systems, only because that's one of the institutional supports that was mentioned in the paper. And then I think something that sort of goes along with that is thinking about the idea of the informal economy. So I think when you're in an urban area, you have a greater chance maybe of being a more formalized working role. And that means that your time might count towards the pension, unless one of these countries' pensions just super guaranteed because you reach a certain age, although I don't think that's true in any of these countries. But I think it's something to think about, like if people, older adults in rural areas who might have worked all their lives, but if they did so in an informal economy, do they still get the same kind of bite at the pension apple, or does that kind of institutional support and that old age financial security look really different in urban versus rural contexts? I'm assuming that itself also might look different across these three countries. Some of what made me kind of generated these thoughts was the data that Shane presented in this table in his presentation. And, you know, I was just kind of looking at it, and it's always really helpful to be able to see the basic characteristics in these studies. But I was really struck by, for instance, the fact that the urban-rural difference in pension in Mexico is, you know, it's like a threefold, fourfold difference. That there was maybe a little more similarity in the pension coverage in India across the urban-rural context. But that, again, it was also quite different in China as well. And I noticed kind of similar things about health insurance. So like really similar urban-rural rates of health insurance. Well, public health insurance availability is what I believe this is. Similar rates in Mexico and China. Actually, it seems like maybe lower coverage in the urban Indian population. And again, also thinking about that not in health insurance and healthcare is the same word across the country, but the context, the quality, the content, the access is very different in urban versus rural settings, and probably even more so in these three countries. So again, I think it's just kind of trying to understand it a little bit more, like a deeper dive into how all of these different characteristics play out in urban and rural settings in these three different studies. And then I think, you know, going forward, I think you should think about some potentially unmeasured confounders. Shane did mention the HOKU status. I think that's super important for the, if you're going to use the Charles data. So my understanding is that depending on your HOKU status, even if you're an urban residing older adult, you really have very different access to government, like public institutional supports. And that has to do with this urban-rural sort of residence of origin. So I think that that's something that you're going to want to incorporate into the model. Looking at Mexico, I thought race ethnicity probably matters here, that there might be some differences in terms of indigenous status. And then in India, I thought maybe like socioeconomic strata might also matter. But really just thinking about the fact that not everyone in a rural experience is going to have a very homogenized experience. Not everyone in an urban context will have a very similar experience, and that you might want to find ways to model some of that population heterogeneity. The good news is these three studies have massive sample sizes, and so you really are empowered to do a lot more digging into your data and trying to tease apart some of this heterogeneity.